Hello, I am Tammy Marshall, and today I'm going to share with you chapters 2 and 3 of the novel that is in this story collection. And the novel is called State of Georgia. The beginning of it is available in an earlier video if you'd like to hear the first chapter. But for those of you who have heard it, this is in chapter 2, followed by chapter 3, which are both very short. Later that night, after the last well-wisher had left her house, after she'd watched Jerry disappear in a taxi bound for the airport and his return flight to base, and after Georgia had rounded up enough sleeping bags for her grandchildren, she sat down at the table where she'd had her final words with Donald. Randy was now seated in the chair where his father had died. They gazed at each other over the assortment of half-eaten pies and other saran-wrapped goodies left by neighbors and co-workers and people whose mail Donald had delivered for 30 years. Randy picked up a cookie and began to munch it, crumbs dropping to the floor where Bowser continued to wait patiently. It had been a good day for the dog, who'd been pleasantly sidetracked all afternoon with fallen treats. Randy reached down and stroked the old dog's head. "Do you think he knows?" Randy asked. Georgia nodded. Then she had a sudden thought. "You should take Bowser home with you." "With me? Why? This is his home." He shot a puzzled look at his mother before passing the rest of the cookie off to the beagle. Georgia sighed. "Yes, it is, but I'm thinking of going away for a bit, and I don't want to kennel him. He's too old for that." "Going away? Where to?" Her son furrowed his brow at her. "I'm not really sure. Just away." She looked around the kitchen and its adjoining breakfast nook where she loved to sit early in the mornings and watch the sun come up, especially in the summers when she could linger over her coffee and not rush off to school. It was all so dear to her, but it was also so meaningless. "I need a change." Randy scowled. "What about your job, your students? You can't just leave them." "Actually, I can, at least at the end of this year. There's no saying that I have to accept my contract for next year." Sensing a change in the atmosphere and that no more treats would be falling, Bowser trotted to his dog bed, circled twice, and plopped down with a grunt. Georgia chuckled and then yawned. "You need to go to bed too, Mom. It's been a long day." She nodded and rubbed her eyes. "Yes, it has. But I meant what I said." She looked long and hard at her eldest child. "I'm calling it quits at the end of this school year, and I plan to tender my resignation once I return to work next week." "Don't you think you're being hasty?" Randy leaned back and crossed his arms over his ample belly. "Dad just passed away. You need to give yourself time to accept that. I don't want you doing something you'll regret." Georgia smiled lightly. "If I don't quit, and if I don't go see some of this world I've only read about, then I certainly will regret it." A silence hung in the air between them. Soft snores came to them from the living room where the grandchildren were all sleeping, and a louder one sounded from the guest bedroom down the hall where Sally and her husband were asleep. "This is just between you and me for now, Randy. I don't want Sally or Jerry knowing my plans. Sally will only try to change my mind with daily phone calls and emails, and Jerry will worry and try to give me money. I don't need or want their concern or their money." Randy smiled wryly. "Why am I always the secret keeper?" "Because you are so good at it." She looked at her son and noticed the sunken spots under his eyes. "I shouldn't have told you this yet either, but thinking about Bowser and wondering what to do with him made me bring it up." "I don't understand, though. Just a few weeks ago we were talking about throwing you and Dad a dual retirement party in a couple of years, and you never said a thing about retiring at the end of the year." Georgia stood and began to cover the dishes of food. "A few weeks ago your father was still alive, and I was still planning on a retirement that included him." She moved toward the refrigerator, and Randy followed her with more platters. He opened the door for her, and they made room for as many perishables as they could. As he closed the door, he caught sight of the numerous photos covering the top half of the refrigerator with magnets. None of the magnets were mementos of places visited. But they were all handmade treasures from him and his siblings' younger years, along with a few newer ones from his nephew and nieces. "Where will you go, Mom?" he asked as his eyes strayed over the pictures. "Where won't I go?" she replied. He turned and looked at his mother. Then he cocked his head enough to catch sight of Bowser asleep on his side with his legs splayed out across the tile floor. A small smile played at his mouth. "Funny. I'd been thinking of getting a dog." Chapter 3. She hadn't expected the uproar that her resignation caused, both in her family and in the school system where she taught so long that many of her current students were grandchildren of a few of her first students. The school board had been counting on her for at least 2 more years, and while they wouldn't mind replacing her with a first-year teacher and thus saving a lot of money in salary payout, they were sorry to lose such a good teacher. Many of her current 3rd graders cried when she told them the news. Even reminding them that she wouldn't have been their teacher next year did nothing to quell the tears of a few of them. One girl said through her sobs, "Yes, but Mrs. Haynes, I still wanted to come visit you next year." Georgia hugged the sad girl and made a promise she doubted she would keep. "I'll come visit you instead. Will that be okay?" The girl considered it for a minute before wiping her face on her sleeve and nodding forlornly. A slew of cards packed her mailbox at home once word got out that she was leaving. Many of the sentiments sent her in a frenzy of tears of despair as she wondered if she were indeed making the right decision. After all, what was 2 more years? "It's 2 more years of my life that I don't want to waste," she reminded herself out loud when the doubt was at its strongest, and those 2 years would be years spent alone in a house full of memories of Donald, and Donald was dead, but she wasn't. Sally was the most contentious when she finally learned the news. Georgia had known she would be, and she was certain that part of Sally's ire came from the fact that she was the last of the children to find out, rather than the first. Georgia knew that Sally had always assumed she'd be there for her. They didn't live far apart, and Georgia and Donald had done their best to attend as many of their grandchildren's functions as possible. However, once when they hadn't been able to get to one of Matthew's recitals, Sally had said, "Don't worry, Mom, when you and Dad retire, you can move closer so you don't miss anything." She hadn't bothered to correct her daughter at that time, but Georgia had never had any desire to move to a retirement complex or a condo nearer her controlling daughter. She loved Sally dearly, but Sally was not her life. When she'd finally broken the news to Sally, her daughter had scoffed. "Oh, Mom, don't be silly. You've never traveled further than Iowa." "That's why I'm doing this now, dear, before it really is too late." Sally looked with disbelief at her mother, concern etching her brow. "Are you ill?" "No, honey. Just bored with my life." Another scoffing sound came from her daughter's throat. "You have a great life, Mom." Georgia nodded. "I agree, but I've always wanted to see the world. Your father wouldn't go anywhere with me, though, and we usually had too many bills and too few dollars to justify me demanding we take a vacation somewhere more interesting than Des Moines." "I don't get it, though, Mom. You only have to, a couple more years left until you can retire, so why do it now?" "Actually, I could have retired years ago, but I kept doing it because I didn't know what else to do with myself. Now, I know what to do." Sally shook her head as if denying it physically would make it not be true. "Where are you going, and how are you going to pay for it?" Georgia smiled. "For starters, I'm heading to California. I've always wanted to see the ocean and those cable cars in San Francisco. I can start drawing my retirement benefits, and your father left a pretty hefty life insurance policy for me, so I'll be okay for a while. If I run out of money, I'll sell the house." "You wouldn't!" A look of horror spread across Sally's freckled face. "If I find a better place to live out my post-traveling days, then yes, I will. After all, it is my house." Sally looked crestfallen. "I know, Mom, but we all grew up here. It's home to me and to the boys." At the sight of her daughter's tear-filled eyes, Georgia stepped toward her and wrapped her arms around her. "I know, dear, so I won't sell it unless I absolutely have to." Sally hugged her mother, a rarity between the two of them. "Promise that you'll call me every night and email me lots of photos of the things you see." Georgia pulled away and smiled at her daughter. I'll call you twice a week, and I'll send those photos only if you show me how to work that digital camera you got me for Christmas. I hope you're enjoying State of Georgia. Again, this book and all my other books are available on Amazon, either as paperback or as ebooks. Thank you for joining me.